Hi YouTubers. So I wanted to make a video today. It's about an issue that's really concerned me, and it's really about the Book of Revelations, and it's actually part of a series. I'm also writing a book about reflections, also on other books in the New Testament too. Just going through it all and looking at what I find is actually relevant and what actually I find is true and what actually I find is not. And I wanted to give my own reflections and my own thoughts on it. I think it's probably kind of important to say why I feel the things I do. Actually, everyone's probably got their own interpretations of things, and that's good for people to sort of realise why they have those. I think really. I think it's an important book because it influences many people and has done for a long time. And I'm going to be reliant on some notes that I've made previously about this. Because it's a book that makes many predictions of the future and makes serious pronouncements, so serious, in fact, that we need to be cautious before either accepting it as true or even as false, or partly true and partly false. We need to be very cautious before accepting or rejecting anything, in fact, that makes claims. In fact, I would say that anything that makes serious claims about your life, whether it's a doctor's or a judge's verdict, whatever it is worthy of serious scrutiny and firm analysis. And I think nothing is beyond questioning, in fact. Nobody and nothing. As Descartes famously said, of course, at some point in your life, you'll get to question everything, including God. And I think that's quite right. And I think anything that is true would welcome questioning, in fact, and would withstand any firm and fair questioning, in fact. And anything that's not probably wouldn't want that. But I think is quite right to be exposed if it does have any flaws, and I think can only better our lives, in fact. So I think actually, if you look at it objectively, as long as the questioning is fair, that is, of course, because we can sometimes have a tendency either to under question things and to not ask poignant questions and to not be pressing on issues because of personal reasons, perhaps, because we're afraid to find out things, or for whatever other reasons. But it could also be that we over question things or that we unfairly question it, that we held it up to standards we would not want to be held up to ourselves. And I've got a number of concerns with this particular book, actually, to be honest, and I have had for quite a long time, in fact. I think one of my first big concerns, actually, is actually that it's described as being a vision of meeting someone, actually. And I find that to be quite disconcerting to start off with, actually. I kind of just don't understand what it means by that. It doesn't go into clear specifics of what kind of a vision. I kind of think there are different kinds of visions, but I tend to sort of describe them as sort of hallucinations or dreams. You can have daydreams when you're awake, or nighttime dreams. You probably only remember the end of them, I guess, and that's quite normal for everyone to have those kind of visions in life. But I think most of us would understand quite reasonably that there's a big difference between having a vision of something, an imagination, if you will, of something, and the actual reality of life. One must be clear what kind of vision is being told about here. Is this a real person that he encounters who tells him these things? Or is this, in fact, something he's imagined or dreamed, something that he's kind of had a hallucination almost of? Now, if I claim myself to have a vision of a neighbour of mine, let's say Mr. Smith, telling me information, I need to be absolutely clear if I report that to other people, if this is factual, if it's a real encounter that I've had with someone, and not a vision at all, but if I've met somebody and they personally gave me that information, well, I need to say that this is a real event that's historically happened and is factual, rather than is something that is a fictional account or a dream or something that just simply reminds us of real life, or something perhaps entirely fictional that could have been made up. So I would need to know precisely if I'm reporting it to someone else, to others, exactly what kind of encounter this is, whether it's real or whether it's imagined. What would anyone think if someone said they had a vision of them and then reported what you had said in that vision as factual, as an actual real encounter? I think we can well imagine what anyone would say. If I rang up the police to say, so and so appeared to me and confessed to a crime or something, I wonder how the police would react to that. I think we can well imagine maybe a psychiatric assessment might be something that they might consider. Dream reality confusion, abbreviated as DRC, is actually a mental disorder where people either are unable to or struggle to know the difference between reality and confusion. I'm not saying that that is what happened. That's just a sort of possibility that I've considered could be, where you have a dream or something, you read into it more and you think that is actually something that is real, and you assume therefore that those things that happen within that dream, or whether it's a daydream or night dream, that you then by extension you think that that actually has got more significance. You actually kind of think that that's real. And there are many psychiatric patients that cannot differentiate between real and fantasy. In fact, the average person doesn't in some situations. Majority of situations we are able to discern between them, but there will always be occasions when even people who are fairly corpus mentis, people who have got reasonable ability, may struggle within a particular scenario to decide because they don't have sufficient information. They've perhaps only heard hearsay or rumours about different things. So it's not always easy. It depends on the search situation. It's not just limited to psychiatric patients only that may struggle to differentiate between what is a real encounter and what is fictional. It's possible that the author of the book was suffering from delusions or not, or that it was purposefully distorted. You may well, to add credence to your own sayings, you may well want to say, oh, so-and-so appeared to me. You might want to say a dead person appeared to you, especially if they were looked up to or they revered at that point. You may well want to sort of use their name to sort of like name drop and to sort of give it more credibility so that it would be more believable to sort of say, rather than saying you yourself alone had that, it might appear to others, especially if somebody has passed on at that point, somebody beyond the grave has appeared to you, and they obviously at that point wouldn't be there to say no, they didn't, and that never happened. And so it could be there's reasons that you might want to add something on to say that somebody has appeared to you, to add credence to your story, to make it seem like it's more believable, so it's backed up by someone else, that other people that maybe had some that they respected or listened to or took into account at least what they said. I mean, what would anyone say if you had a vision of someone committing a crime and the next day the police showed up? You might think it was collective madness. But if I have a vision, I will write the context of it. I need to be sure who or what I'm referring to be clear, because I would want to seek a clarity of communication rather than add any confusion to others. So I'd want to be absolutely sure. I'd want to say the context. I had a dream last night, or somebody came to me, and I do have dreams of people that have passed on. I talk to them, but I know that's not them. That's my imagination of them. I'm quite clear about that. But if I was to write, so-and-so appeared to me in a dream and said this, I'm not going to think or describe it as them. I'm going to say it's the context of a dream, and that it's kind of my imagination of them, but it's not actually them. So I would need to actually be clear to add the context if I would do something like that. But in fact, legally, I need to be absolutely certain if I'm referring to an actual fictional person, an imagination of a real person, a dream even perhaps, or if I'm actually recalling an actual historical encounter that really happened. And if I'm not going to do that, then actually it could easily be considered as libel or a defamation of character, something that's considered a crime. But it's not just a criminal offence, it's also something that's quite immoral and something no one would want to be misrepresented either. From my reading of this book of Revelations, as it's called, it begins with this man named John of Patmos. I believe he lived in some sort of island where he's secluded or something, having this so-called vision at that time. I read this I've read it many times, in fact, discussed it with many people. And I read it as a kind of dream like imagination that he encountered, but not a real thing in actual fact. He does not, for example, begin the book autobiographically, as he could well have done, and many books do begin. I met so and so down the road on such and such a date. This was the scenario. This was the location, the situation. This is what he looked like, and this is what he said. And I could have presented the actual real-time scenario context, but it wasn't. It wasn't written in that sense. So he could have said that he met a real person, but it wasn't described like that. It was described as a vision or dream. And for me, that already begins with a sort of, so it's already sort of, how reliable are dreams? Well, if I lived my life by them, I'd be sectioned or in prison. So, it's just, they may have some sort of, it may give you some sort of information but quite a lot of mine are absurd, to be honest. They're ridiculous, and some of them are just plain awful. Some of them are just absolutely wonderful, and there are a whole kind of spectrum of things I couldn't easily, but I would never describe them as something that's real. Certainly, dreams and visions, they can be enlightening, and they can reveal great insights. Into many things, especially through symbolic language. And this is why so many of us will use fantasy, indeed, as a genre to write stories. I myself like to use fantasy too. We all do, and we like to explore different themes that do relate to the real world. And although the characters that I create are entirely fictional, even so, the dilemmas they face and how they're constructed are based on my own life experiences, of course, like with any author, of course. And they bear some relation to the real world, but they're not historical. It's not a factual encounter, and I never describe it as that, and it would be quite wrong to ever do that. Fantasy as a genre can be a wonderful way of exploring real issues, of looking at things in a different way. Yet for all the intrigue in the scope for investigating, we must be cautious, never passing off fiction as fact. And of course, that's what makes all investigators wary, isn't it? Made up stories, of course. But it's only when those stories are perpetrated as being factual. I think that's where the fault lies. Well, of course, if you have fantasy that declares itself as fantasy, that's okay, isn't it? That's different altogether. Fiction does bear some resemblance to fact sometimes, of course. To reality. It never entirely is divorced. Even the most fantastical novel is written in a time by a person in a particular place who creates this fiction from the reality of the world they live around them, even if he borrows from other fictions. But they ultimately have been written by some author living in some reality. So fiction and fact are never entirely divorced. Yet neither are they totally one and the same, of course. Yet one can strive to record details accurately, biographically, writing a story that is based on facts. So, of course, there's a completely different genre of that, of course, where you try to describe things accurately. I went to work earlier, I was there for 2 hours, I got a bus there, and I got a bus home, I walked home, in fact. So if I'm describing something factually, that's things that actually have happened today. All this is quite obvious when you stop and think about it, of course. But even in our factual occasions, we make mistakes sometimes. Witnesses will make mistakes even when they try to be honest about it. And yet it's not always obvious in real life what relation a story has to reality, of course. A psychiatric patient, to give you an example, suffering with some delusions, will make some absurd and bizarre claims sometimes. We might be tempted to dismiss all he has said, except he might have had some profound insights as well, and as can be the case, as does happen. He may reveal things to us we had not known, in fact. This occurs more often than one might think, actually. A patient will often reveal some astounding facts, indeed. He had either not known or not known that he had known. Or he knew it but didn't know the significance of it, perhaps. It could be some obscure truth or something that he didn't know the relevance of at the time. Yet just because one may reveal some grand truths doesn't imply that that person, therefore, is all-knowing and therefore infallible. So it tends to be that everyone will record some things that are true, even when they're trying their best to. But particularly when you're under strain, suffering, and under severe pressures, and under difficult situations, much more likely then to make a lot of mistakes, and even for whatever reasons to sometimes make things up, actually. In fact, even well-meaning, relatively sane individuals will sometimes make mistakes, even in remembering facts or interpreting them, or in the process of logical deduction. That is to say, we all make mistakes, grammatically, semantically, ethically even. No author is totally infallible, and at most, we must surely therefore, it must follow that no book or film or anything by extension related to a person is either, because all people make mistakes, whether they're authors, storers, translators, or even whether they're preserving and keeping information. In fact, viewing any book or library, a bibliothèque, of course, is a collection of books. Viewing any of those as perfect is just really creating another idol to replace God. Either if you believe in God is alone perfect, but we as people make mistakes. And even if you're atheist, your life experience should teach you that nobody around you is infallible. Nobody makes perfect things. Everybody does some wrong things on purpose and some things by mistake. And idolizing a book, or even in the modern world, a film or program, is really by extension also a way of idolizing humanity, in fact. Since all medias are created by humanity, in fact. So really, if we idolize things that are created by man, it's just another way for us to idolize mankind and ourselves, ultimately. God does inspire people, of course, yet we still have the ability to misinterpret, to lose focus, and to make some mistakes, because we're all human and we're all capable also of doing good and bad to each other. But thinking that a book is not perfect, not infallible, not a replacement, therefore, for God, that doesn't mean that some inspirational information could be there, perhaps something even divinely inspired. An honest author will always thank God for the truly inspirational, yet also concede that there are errors, and the errors are down to his or herself. And this is obviously true if you realise, of course, that no man is all good. We all make mistakes. We should not give any book or authors a free ride above being criticised and looked at fairly and scrutinised. Nothing is beyond questioning, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, the Red Book in communist China. Anything written by a man should be fairly questioned, because all men can make mistakes. And when you idolise something and you don't allow it to be fairly questioned, then you're creating an idol of it. Then you're saying that's sacrosanct, that's something, you are then allowing it a free ride, basically, so that it can't be questioned. And actually the problem with that is you don't allow it to be proven true, and you don't allow it to be proven false either, if you don't allow that natural investigation process to proceed. If you don't allow someone to ask fair questioning. You're quite entitled to ask, is the questioning itself fair, of course? Is it objective? Is it non-partisan, non-biased? Does it try to sort of consider the actual facts? So we shouldn't give any book or authors of those books a free ride. We should always strive to be consistent, to be firm but fair in our criticism, of course, and actually to apply those same standards to ourselves. That's the consistency in that objectivity, of course. Of course, one of the most obvious criticisms that I have about the book is the idol worship that seems to be quite central within it, actually. This saviour type figure, described as a lamb almost, that's worshipped at one point during the book. And it's something that I just, in the gut of my soul, am absolutely against, and I will be to the end of my days. And it's something that I can't stand. And the Old Testament preaches against it. I do too. And it's something that is just something that is blasphemous, really, and is against the Ten Commandments. In fact, so it contradicts the actual original understanding of the Mosaic commandments, of the original early Jewish faith, that actually you look at it as it can only be written by someone with a different, liberal, sectarian, kind of pagan view on life, but not with a monotheistic view. You know, it's got this whole part in there where there's this lamb who's described symbolically as a holy person. But I don't want to be sort of too dependent on the Mosaic commandments and the traditional original Jewish faith, because I actually look at it in terms of your life experience. My own life experience has taught me there's no one who's totally holy. I've never met them. I'm not. And I know no one I met is. No one is infallible. No one is perfect. This is an imaginary figure. And we create that because it's great for us to think there is a saviour figure who's great and going to come in and save all of us. And actually, in fact, it doesn't live up to any realistic, credible, everyday experiences. It's not my experience of life. I'm not like that. The people I met aren't like that. Even the nicest people I met had some faults about them, if I'm honest. And, and that's normal for me, that I find that even people I really like and admire and respect many things about, and I see great virtues of, they even have their flaws, the wrong things, and things where none of us are worthy of being worshipped, actually. And I find that there is something really quite disgusting almost about that and absurd about that idea. And that goes against all my evidence, which is my life experience, teaching me that all of us have our own different problems, our flaws, our corruptions that we struggle with. Sometimes we don't, but when we do, we do. But if we're honest enough to acknowledge that, how much we might like or admire someone, you can't see anyone as being flawless or perfect or sinless. I haven't experienced that at all, except in fantasy novels, but never in reality. Superman or Spider-Man or any of those superhero figures, maybe, but in the real life, outside of the pantomime fantasy of world, in the actual day-to-day encounters with real people in real scenarios, I find flawed people that have often been through hard times, difficult situations, sometimes have been victims of things in the past, sometimes have done great noble and heroic things, and sometimes I've done villainous things as well, actually. And I find that people are complicated and difficult in actual fact. But that's my life experience. It might be that the audience have found a perfect person that's flawless and lamb-like, and that they have found that. But that's not my experience at all, not of myself, if I'm honest. I'm a million miles from where I should be. I've done a lot of awful things over the years. Sometimes for reasons and other times not. Sometimes because I've been mad. Sometimes I've been just bad, like any of us, I guess. And I find that that's the only honest answer I can have to that, really. But just because that part I do find false in the book, the idol worship part, that doesn't mean, therefore, by implication, that all the other parts are. But it does, therefore, mean that the book as a whole is not infallible, and I don't then accept everything just because it's in the book. All the more reason, therefore, to question other things fairly, I think. But that's my life experience, that I haven't found any perfect people. I haven't found anyone lamb-like. I haven't found anyone infallible who's meek all the time. On the contrary, I find people that are very meek sometimes, but very argumentative and angry and upset at other times as well, actually. I find people that are emotionally, mentally, physically, psychologically quite complicated, actually, as human beings. But that's my experience of life. Other people, I doubt it very much, because I haven't met anyone credible that actually claimed to have met an infallible, lamb-like, perfect person. So I'm willing to change my mind if I encountered or met this person, but knowing I'm nothing like that, and none of the people I ever met were, I suppose I can't go against 30 years experience really, because that's sort of my evidence, I suppose. And if I didn't take that into consideration, what have I been learning all these years, I suppose? So I stick to the facts that no man is good, or I would say no man is all good, implying that we do some good and bad, but I would say no man is all good. Otherwise, it might imply we have absolutely no good, rather than not being totally good. And more obviously, is it not written, as I said earlier, to worship only the Lord your God, referencing the Mosaic 10 Commandments, of course. There's only one God, and the idea of worshipping a person contradicts that, in fact. How can a book, therefore, contain something that breaks this commandment and that contradicts all those earlier books? And that to me, and I do hold those 10 Commandments as being quite sacred, actually. Not because they're written in a book, but because having studied them, I find that they do live up to some sort of moral scrutiny, and they do each have a purpose. And I can sort of see their psychological, their moral and emotional reality about them. So I'm sort of more willing to believe that than a book that would contradict that. Of course, one might not believe in the 10 Commandments. We should not believe in something just because it's old or famous or popular. Yet ask yourself honestly, how many morally perfect people have you met in your life? In my own experience, none. And further, worshipping others, has that in your experience ever been a good thing? Or has that really led to vanity, flattery, and creating false, holier-than-thou impressions that created distortion of views? That is to say, when we treat others as gods, it is at our peril, of course. And that's been my experience in life, this holier-than-thou perfect image. It actually allows people to hide behind that. And so many abuses can be hidden behind that, in fact. And it just creates this sort of false impression. Not only that, of course, it makes the rest of us feel inferior, that we can't live up to that. And, it's like... And it's just something that's not real either. It's like having unrealistic expectations. It's like you want to live up to, being a superhero, but the reality is, we all have our problems. We're all flawed. We all have our limitations in power, in knowledge, in our mental and physical abilities, in our ethics, in our willingness to help each other in our life. So we all have our various limitations, albeit they may alter and change at times. But no one's perfect all the time, and I really would doubt anyone that told me otherwise, quite frankly. But that's been my experience, and I'm not here to tell other people what their experiences are. They must search within themselves and their memories and come to their own conclusions. We should both be wary of deifying or also demonizing other people, making people to be much better than they really were, or making people to seem much worse than they really are. Too tempting to do either, of course, when we dislike someone or when we admire them. Yes, we can all do lots of good, and we can all do lots of bad, and sometimes you meet people that even do both, of course. We must strive, though, for an honest account, however complicated, resisting pantomimes, oversimplifying people, because people are complicated, life is, and we should be cautious about what we tell others, in talk or in writing, and also what we choose to accept from the world itself. And I will never accept or be part of any worship of a lamb or any person, in fact. And it's something that I make a commitment to on a daily basis, because I think that once I do idolize anyone, whether it's myself or other people, then I gloss over the flaws, then I don't see the need to change, and that actually there is a need for us all to seek salvation and repentance, actually, and that we all have faults, that we all have things we need to improve about ourselves, actually. We all have good virtues, things that we should admire and continue doing as well, but we should be able to look at each other's faults and talk about those things as well, in fact. And one day I must answer to God. And if I declared myself as fit for worthy, it wouldn't just be the fact that I'd misled lots of people and lied to them and deceived them. It would also be the fact that my soul would be judged at some point, and that could be condemned. And I would, I think that would probably be a terrible thing, and I would have to face whatever awful consequences that would behold me there. Over the years, I've had countless discussions with many who consider themselves different sectarian Christians from various different groups. But they virtually, mostly, nearly all held the Bible to be infallible. And this seemed to be quite an argumentating point, actually, that I found with many people, despite the glaring number of different contradictions from different books. So I would kind of look at it more that they represent different sectarian groups that established gradually over many decades, even centuries, in fact. And that those contradictions probably are there because different sectarian groups tended to look at things from quite different viewpoints, and that seems the most realistic understanding. That's in regard to this infamous book of Revelations. All Christians, without exception, struggle to understand the language of the book. And there were so many discussions that took place about all the symbolic language and how vague and how many it could be interpreted in such a multifaceted layer of different ways, and why this language was so obscure and strange in how it described things as it was. It borrowed quite a lot, of course, from the book of Daniel from the Old Testament. Although I don't call it that, from an older text, and I think it obviously borrowed some things from some Jewish teachings, but it seemed to add quite a lot of pagan teachings in terms of its idolatry, in terms of its worship of the Lamb and so forth. But in terms of its type of language, in terms of it being so vague and so metaphorical and obscure at times, it was almost like in a code-like fashion where you had to sort of know, you had to have sort of like a code breaker to understand it. And it led to so many different arguments, different people having different theories of what it meant, and like theories and counter theories and all this. And I sort of felt like, why wouldn't a book be open, and why wouldn't the idea of a book to try and be simplify and to make difficult situations clearer and to seek a clarity of communication? Most books try to make complicated, difficult issues in life simpler, in layman's speak, so that it's easier to understand, so that it can be communicated in day-to-day kind of matter-of-fact language. So why would the author therefore use such language? Why might this be? Especially when most books are trying to clarify things, to use as simple as possible language, without actually doing a disservice to the sometimes complicated subjects, to reveal the concepts as much as possible. But Revelation seems to do quite the opposite, in fact, of concealing things and making things more difficult to understand.